Hello, and welcome to Sunset Zen and Sleepy Stories. Please relax, listen, and enjoy. The Long Green Way, a series of 10 stories from the Appalachian Trail. Story 1, The First Morning. Springer Mountain, Georgia, late May. The alarm did not wake Thomas Calloway so much as find him already awake, lying on his back in the darkness of the motel room, staring at a ceiling he could not see. He had been awake for some time. He was not sure how long. The numbers on the clock said 4:47, and the alarm was set for 5, and so he reached over and turned it off before it could sound, which was a thing he had done almost every morning of his adult life. Anticipated the alarm, forestalled it, risen on his own terms, and he lay there a moment longer before sitting up and placing his feet on the floor. The carpet was thin and rough beneath his heels. The room smelled of old air conditioning and something faintly floral, a cleaning product or a candle, something that was trying, in a modest and unconvincing way, to smell like home. Across the room, in the other bed, they had taken a room with 2 queens, the boys sharing. He could hear his sons breathing. He sat with that for a while. He did not turn on a light. He just listened to them breathe. Owen on the far side, slow and deep, the way he had always slept, as if sleep were something he had studied and perfected, and Eli closer to the edge, a little uneven, turning once with a soft sound, some brief negotiation with a dream. They were 22 and 24. They were enormous, and they were his boys, and they were leaving, both of them, within the month, Owen, to Edinburgh for a doctoral program in marine biology, Eli to begin whatever it was that came after 4 years of environmental studies at a university 3 states away, which so far appeared to be this hike, these 3 weeks, this trail. Thomas was 53 years old. He was a high school history teacher. He had broad shoulders that had narrowed somewhat with the years, and hands that were still strong from a decade of weekend woodworking, a hobby he had taken up after the divorce and which had given him, he felt, something to do with the part of himself that needed to make things. He was not a man who talked easily about his feelings, but he was a man who thought about them often, carefully, the way he thought about his lesson plans, turning them over, considering them from different angles, trying to understand what they were really about beneath what they appeared to be about. He stood up quietly. He felt for his clothes in the dark and dressed without sound. He found his boots and carried them to the bathroom, where he sat on the edge of the tub and laced them in the yellow light, and looked at his own face in the mirror for a moment, and then looked away. They had driven down from Virginia in Thomas's truck, the 3 of them, 2 days ago. 17 hours with stops, the cab full of gear bags, and the particular smell of men who are about to do something outdoors. A smell of nylon and sunscreen and energy bar wrappers, and, underneath all of it, something like anticipation, which does not have a smell exactly, but which seems to inhabit the air the way weather does, changing the quality of everything it touches. They had talked a great deal on the drive, and they had also been quiet for long stretches, which was one of the things Thomas had always loved about his sons. They knew how to be quiet without it meaning anything was wrong. Owen had read from a guidebook while Eli drove, reciting facts about the trail in a voice that was half informational and half theatrical, because Owen had always narrated things. He had done it as a small boy, a running commentary on whatever he was doing. Now I am putting the block here. Now I am deciding about the blue one. And somewhere along the way the habit had evolved into something more sophisticated, but essentially unchanged. He was a person who processed the world by describing it. Did you know, Owen had said somewhere in North Carolina, that the trail passes through 14 states and takes an average of 5 to 7 months for a through hiker to complete. I did know that, said Eli, who was driving. Did you know that only about 1 in 4 people who attempt a through hike actually finish? I did know that too. Did you know, Owen continued, undeterred, that the trail has a white blaze, a 2 by 6 inch rectangle of white paint on trees and rocks, every few hundred feet for almost the entire length, so that you essentially cannot get lost if you just keep looking for the blazes. I did not know the specific dimensions, Eli said. 2 by 6, like a little white door. A little white door, Thomas repeated from the back seat, where he had been reading and half listening. He liked that, a little white door. He thought about writing it down, but he didn't. They were not through hiking. They did not have 5 months, or even close to it. They had 22 days, which Thomas had arranged by combining his remaining personal days with the first week of summer. 22 days, beginning at the southern terminus on Springer Mountain in Georgia, heading north. They would cover what they could. They would not rush. By 5:15, all 3 of them were dressed and packed and standing in the motel parking lot in the pre-dawn dark, the air cool and damp and smelling of Georgia pine, which smells different from Virginia pine. Sharper, greener. As if the trees are younger and more earnest about the whole enterprise of being trees. The truck sat under a light. Their packs were enormous. Thomas had rented a storage unit near the motel for the things they would not need on the trail, and even after that editing, his pack was 60 liters and weighed 31 pounds, which was, Owen had informed him, on the heavy side for a long-distance hike, but within the range of reasonable for a person who was not a purist. I'm not a purist, Thomas had said. No, Owen agreed. You are a person who insists on bringing a real pillow. I sleep better with a real pillow. You'll sleep fine on the ground. We'll see. Weeks ago, and had tested it 3 times in his apartment, and this morning he had set his own alarm for 4:30 and made coffee in the motel room before the others woke. And now he was standing in the parking lot, distributing it from a thermos into 3 collapsible silicone cups. This was the kind of thing Eli did. He was the one who remembered the coffee, who checked the weather 3 days in advance, who knew where the first aid kit was and what was in it. He had his mother's practical intelligence, her capacity for looking at a situation and identifying what it needed. Thomas had always been grateful for this quality in both of them, Eli and his mother, because he himself tended to think about things more than he attended to them. To the trail, said Owen, holding up his cup. To the trail, said Eli. Thomas held up his cup and looked at his sons in the yellow light of the parking lot, their faces young and known and already, in some way he could not fully articulate even to himself, beginning to recede from him. Not in this moment, not yet, but in the way that all moments eventually recede, the way he was already, even as it was happening, aware that this would become a memory, and that the memory would matter. To the trail, he said. The coffee was good. Eli had ground the beans at home and brought them in a sealed jar. It was dark and not too bitter, and Thomas drank it slowly, the warmth of it moving through his chest like a hand placed gently there. The approach trail to Springer Mountain begins at Amicalola Falls State Park, roughly 8.5 miles of ascent before you even reach the official southern terminus. The dark one day, and they had debated whether to do the full approach through the falls and up, or to drive to a Forest Service road that allowed a shorter hike to the top. They had decided, eventually, to drive to the road and begin from there, saving the approach for a future trip, perhaps, or not. Owen would be in Scotland. Eli would be somewhere, and future trips had a way of remaining future. This was a quiet grief, small and familiar, the kind that Thomas had been carrying for some years. Not a dramatic grief, just the ongoing fact of time, its direction, the way it moved everything forward whether you were ready or not. He had been thinking about readiness a great deal lately. The forest road was unpaved, and the truck moved slowly over it, headlights cutting through the dark between the trees. It was just after 6 when they parked. The sky still more black than blue, but beginning, barely, to relent at its eastern edge. They stood at the trailhead, adjusting straps, shifting weight, the way you do when you are new to something heavy, finding the balance, making small negotiations with your own body. "Okay," said Owen. "Okay," said Eli. Thomas took a breath of the morning air, which was cool and clean and full of something, pine resin, earth, the particular dampness of a forest before the sun arrives. He could hear a creak somewhere, very faint, and somewhere above that, a bird beginning its morning argument with the dark. "Ready?" Eli asked, looking at his father. Thomas considered the word. He was 53 years old. His knees were not young. His pack was 31 pounds. His sons were leaving, and the trail was 2,190 miles long, and they would walk a small piece of it for 22 days, and then it would be over. "Ready," he said. The first mile of any long trail is a strange mile. It is the mile in which the idea of the thing becomes the fact of the thing, and these are not always comfortable with each other. Thomas walked behind his sons, watching their backs rise and fall with each step, and he thought about how strange it was to watch people you love move through the world, how ordinary and how miraculous it seemed at the same time. The trail moved upward through a mixed hardwood forest, oak and maple and tulip poplar, their leaves full and green in the approaching morning, making a canopy overhead that was not yet lit, but was waiting to be lit, patient. The way forests always seem patient. The undergrowth was dense on either side of the path, ferns and mountain laurel and dog hobble, the last of which Owen had already identified and described to no one in particular, because Owen identified plants and animals the way other people breathe, without planning to, without being able to stop. "Dog hobble," he said, gesturing, also called fetterbush, native to the Appalachians. The name comes from the fact that hunting dogs would get tangled in it while chasing prey. Deer don't have the same problem, apparently. More agile. More agile than dogs? Eli said. More agile through dense undergrowth, yes. Dogs would probably disagree. The dogs are not here to offer their perspective. Thomas smiled, listening to them. They had always been like this, a particular frequency between them, quick and dry and easy, the conversation of two people who had spent a childhood in the same rooms and had arrived at a private language. He had listened to it for 2 decades, and it still gave him something he could not name, some warmth in the chest that was both happiness and its complicated neighbor. He focused on his breathing. The trail was steep here, moving up through switchbacks, and he could feel the pack's weight settling into his hips, where the hip belt was doing its work. His boots were broken in. He had walked miles in them over the past 2 months, deliberately, in preparation, and they felt right on his feet, substantial and trustworthy. A squirrel moved in the canopy above them. Somewhere ahead, the bird that had been arguing with the dark began to win the argument. By the time they reached Springer Mountain, the sun had crested the eastern ridge and was moving through the trees in long, warm diagonals, lighting the forest floor in irregular patches, the way light always falls through leaves, broken and golden and astonishing, the way it always seems astonishing, no matter how many times you've seen it. The summit is modest, as summits go. A rock, a plaque, a register box nailed to a tree, inside which hikers sign their names and their start dates, and sometimes a few words, an intention, a dedication, a small declaration of hope. They had arrived before any other hikers. The summit was theirs, quiet and still, the air warming now but not yet warm. The sky above the trees a blue so clear it seemed almost thin, as if you could push through it. They stood at the plaque, bronze, embedded in the rock, marking the southern terminus, and Eli photographed it while Owen read it aloud, and Thomas stood slightly apart, looking out through the trees at the ridgeline rolling north, the direction they would walk, the direction of all the days ahead. Ridge after ridge, blue-green and soft with distance. The mountains folding into each other the way sleeping animals do, without urgency, without end. This is where it begins, he thought. All of it. From here, north. You want to sign the register? Eli asked, holding out a pen. The register was a composition notebook, its pages soft with humidity and handling, filled with names in dozens of different handwritings, neat and cramped and looping and barely legible, names from all over, dates going back to January. Thomas took the pen. He opened to the first blank page and read the last few entries above it. Starlight and Graybeard, heading north, may our knees hold. 3 sisters, Savannah G.A., for our grandmother who always wanted to do this. Solo, day 1, scared and excited and mostly excited. He thought for a while. Then he wrote, Thomas Calloway and Sons Owen and Eli, Virginia. 3 weeks, heading north. Walking while we still can, together. He handed the pen to Owen, who read what his father had written and was quiet for a moment, and then wrote his own name below. Eli wrote his below Owen's. They stood there in the morning, at the beginning of a thing. As I was taking out secluded demonstrated, the descent from Springer Mountain, heading north, drops into a long, lovely valley before climbing again. And this first stretch of trail, between the summit and the first shelter, is considered one of the gentler sections, well maintained, well marked, moving through forests that are old and quiet, and full of the small industry of early summer. This is the time of year when everything in the Appalachians is at its most extravagantly green. Not the dark, tired green of late summer, not the yellowing green of September, but the almost unbelievable green of late May, when the leaves are young and full of light, when even the shadows are green-tinted, when you walk through the forest and feel, in some wordless way, that you are inside something alive. Thomas felt it immediately. He had been to the mountains before. He had taken the boys camping when they were small, weekend trips in Shenandoah, a few nights in the Blue Ridge, but he had not spent time on the Appalachian Trail itself. And there was something about the trail, about the specific quality of attention it required, that was different from casual hiking. You were not simply moving through the woods. You were following a thread. You were part of a long, continuous human intention that had been making this same journey, north-south, beginning-end, for generations. He thought about the people who had walked this exact ground, the indigenous peoples who had moved through these mountains for thousands of years before anyone called them the Appalachians, or drew a line through them on a map, the settlers and the soldiers and the hunters. The Depression-era visionary Benton Mackay, who had imagined the trail in 1921 as a kind of refuge from the encroachments of industrial life, a long, wild place where people could walk and think and be something other than workers. The trail had been completed in 1937, blazed and linked by hiking clubs and volunteers, maintained ever since by people who loved it enough to spend their weekends doing it. Thousands and thousands of hikers in the decades since, through hikers and section hikers and day hikers, people carrying grief and people carrying joy and people carrying both at once, which is usually the way. He was aware, walking, that he was part of something, that the trail did not care who he was or what he was carrying, but that it held him anyway, the way any large and patient thing holds the smaller, more urgent things that move through it. They stopped for breakfast at a flat spot beside a creek, an hour into the walk. The sun was fully up now, and the day had committed to warmth, a soft warmth with no humidity yet, that would come later in the season, Thomas knew. The dense wet heat of a southern Appalachian summer. But for now, the air was easy, and the creek made its sound over the stones, and they sat on logs and ate the granola bars and dried fruit and peanut butter crackers that Eli had portioned into small bags the night before. "I've been thinking," Owen said, with the particular tone he used when he had been thinking for some time and was finally ready to report on it. "About what?" Eli asked. "About how to be on a trail for 3 weeks." He paused. "Like, the philosophy of it, the philosophy of hiking, of long-distance hiking, which is different from hiking." He ate a cracker. "When you hike for a day, the goal is to reach a place, a summit, a view, a lake. The place is the point. But when you hike for weeks, the place can't be the point, because you're not really going anywhere, not in the usual sense. You're just moving through." "We're going north," Thomas said. "Nominally," Owen said. "But north isn't a destination. Not really. So what is the point? What are we doing, besides walking?" Eli threw a small pebble into the creek. It made a clean sound, disappeared. "Walking," he said. "That's circular. Maybe that's the point." Owen considered this. "Maybe," he said, though he did not seem convinced. Thomas watched the creek. It was narrow here, 6 feet across, moving quickly over a bed of rounded gray-brown stones, making the sound that water always makes when it moves over stones, something between music and white noise, something that the mind can settle into without quite resting, the way a hammock moves without being still. "I think," Thomas said, "that the point changes as you go." He paused. He was not used to speaking like this, offering thoughts before he had finished having them. But something about the morning and the creek and his sons made it feel possible. Thomas asked, "What is that?" "At the beginning, the point is the beginning, starting, doing the thing, getting underway. In the middle, the point is the middle. And at the end, what's the point at the end?" Owen asked. "I'm not sure yet," Thomas said. "We haven't gotten there." Owen nodded slowly. This seemed to satisfy him, or at least to give him something to work with. He finished his crackers and brushed the crumbs from his legs and looked up at the canopy, where the light was now moving in a slow drift, as a light wind moved the upper leaves. "There's a pileated woodpecker up there," he said. "You can tell by the call, that crazy laugh sound." They all listened, and sure enough, somewhere above them, hidden in the upper canopy, something was laughing, or close enough to laughing that the difference didn't much matter. Writing the ways until writing the background. The trail through this first section moves through a corridor of trees, so dense that the sky appears only in fragments, glimpses of blue between the leaves. Sudden clearings where the light pours down and then closes again as you walk back into the shade. The understory here is rich, wild ginger at the base of the oaks, violet wood sorrel making small pink stars against the dark soil, trillium in its brief season, nearly done, but still showing a few survivors, white flowers gone soft at the edges. Thomas was not a botanist, that was Owen, but he had learned the names of some of these plants from a field guide he had bought and read twice in the weeks before the trip, and he found that knowing a name changed the way you saw a thing. Not completely. Not from mystery to fact, but from anonymity to presence. A trillium was not just a flower. It was trillium, a specific member of a specific family, a thing with a history and a name and a place in the order of things. He thought this was probably true of people too. Owen moved at the front of their small group, setting a pace that was neither fast nor slow, considered sustainable, the pace of someone who understood that they had many miles ahead of them and who was calibrating accordingly. He had a trail name already, from a weekend backpacking trip the previous fall, Almanac, because of his relentless production of facts. Eli had been given the name Compass on the same trip, for reasons that made sense to anyone who spent time with him. He was the one who always knew which direction they were going, who checked the map without being asked, who never knows then better, who researches meaning, who feels better, who seemed to have an internal sense of orientation that the others lacked. Thomas had not had a trail name. He had not hiked enough to earn one. "You'll get one," Eli had said. "What do you think it'll be?" Eli had looked at him for a moment. "Something good," he said, which was not informative, but which Thomas appreciated anyway. At mid-morning, they stopped at a viewpoint, a rocky outcropping where the trail bent close to the edge of the ridge, and the trees fell away, and the mountains appeared, ridge after ridge in the blue distance, south and west, Georgia spreading itself out under the sun in an extravagance of green. It was a long view, the kind of view that makes you feel both very small and very grateful for your smallness, because the alternative, to be the scale of what you're looking at, seems like it would be lonely. They stood at the edge for a while without speaking. Thomas tried to memorize it, which is a thing you always try to do with views like this and which never quite works, because memory is not a photograph. It is something more impressionistic, more emotional. You remember the feeling of a thing more reliably than the details of it. He thought, "I will remember that I felt something here. I will not remember exactly what the light did, or the precise shade of blue in the farthest ridge, or the way the wind moved through the scrubby vegetation at the edge of the rock. I will remember my sons standing beside me." Owen was pointing something out to Eli, a hawk, a red-tailed hawk, riding a thermal up from the valley below, rising in slow circles, effortless, as if it were not flying so much as simply choosing to be higher. They watched it rise. It banked once and caught the light on its tail, that famous red-orange, the color of turning leaves, visible even at this distance, and then it was above the tree line and gone. "I want to come back here," Owen said quietly. "Then come back," said Eli. Owen paused. He was looking at the mountains, not his brother. "I just mean, I don't want to only see it once." Thomas understood what Owen was saying. He understood it in his chest, which was where he understood most things that mattered. "We'll see a lot of views," Thomas said. "Some of them will bring you back. That's how it works." Owen nodded. He was still looking out. He was 24 years old and he was going to Scotland, and he had stood at the edge of a cliff in the Georgia mountains looking south at a hawk rising and said, "I want to come back here." And Thomas thought, this is why we came. Not for the summit, not for the miles, not for any philosophy of walking. For this, for standing at the edge of something large and feeling it together. They stopped for lunch at a shelter, a 3-sided wooden structure with a roof and a raised sleeping platform, the kind that appears every 8 to 12 miles along the trail, each with a name and a water source nearby. This one was Hawk Mountain Shelter, and they had it to themselves, which would not last. It was a Saturday, and by evening the shelter would fill with weekend hikers, but for now it was empty and peaceful, and smelled of old wood and pine. They ate lunch sitting on the edge of the platform, feet dangling. Ellie had made their lunches at the motel the night before, pita bread with hummus and sun-dried tomatoes and sliced hard salami, which was not what Thomas usually ate for lunch, but which tasted, in this place in this light, extraordinary. He ate slowly, the way you eat when you are very hungry and the food is exactly right. "How are your knees?" Eli asked him. "Fine so far. The descent will be harder on them than the ascent." "I know. I have the poles. Make sure you use them. On descents especially, don't be proud." "I am not proud about my knees," Thomas said. "My knees have made me humble." Owen laughed at this. Eli smiled. Thomas ate the last of his pita and looked up at the sky through the gap in the trees above the shelter and thought, 22 days. 21 more to go after today. This is the first one. The first one. He thought about firsts. Owen's first day of school, he had walked in without looking back, which Thomas had been told to hope for and which had still, somehow, hurt. Eli's first day of college, the drive home afterward through the mountains with the truck too quiet, and the seat beside him empty, and the strange new knowledge that the house would be different now. And before all that, Owen's first steps, taken in the living room while Thomas filmed it on a camera that he still had somewhere in a box. Eli's first word, which was light, spoken in the kitchen, pointing at the overhead fixture as Thomas held him. Light, his son had said, at 11 months, and Thomas had wept, quietly, while Eli looked at him with the mild curiosity of someone who did not yet understand that fathers sometimes wept. Light, 23 years ago. He looked at Eli now. His younger son was eating, looking at the map on his phone, planning the afternoon's route. He had his mother's cheekbones, a certain quality of stillness, an efficiency of presence. He was a good man. They both were. Thomas had tried to have a hand in that, and suspected that mostly he had simply been lucky, that his sons had arrived good, and had remained good despite his many imperfections as a father. His long stretches of distraction, the years after the divorce, when he had been less present than he wanted to be. They did not seem to hold this against him. They were generous with him in a way that he was still learning to accept. "What's the plan?" he asked Eli. "We've got about 4 more miles to camp. Long Branch campsite. There's a water source there, reliable this time of year. We should make it by mid-afternoon, which gives us time to set up before dinner." "Good," said Thomas. "How's the pack feeling?" "Heavy. It'll get lighter as we eat the food." "That's a comforting thought. Also, your body will adjust. By day 3 or 4, you won't notice the weight." Thomas looked at his son. "You've hiked enough to know that?" "I've read enough to know that," Eli said. "Which is almost the same thing." "Almost," Thomas agreed. The afternoon miles were different from the morning miles. The morning had been the freshness of beginning, the novelty of it, the heightened awareness that comes when you are doing something new and the senses are awake to everything. The afternoon was something else, the settling. The realization that your body is a thing that is doing this, that your feet are moving over ground and your legs are working and your breath is going in and out, and that this will continue for many hours, over many days, and that somewhere in the repetition of it, something shifts. Thomas felt the shift beginning, late in the afternoon, around the 3rd mile of the day. It arrived not as a dramatic change, but as a quieting. His mind, which had been busy all morning with thoughts and observations, and the low-level social calculation of walking with other people, began to settle. Not to stop. He was still thinking. But the thoughts became less effortful, less urgent. They moved through him the way the light moved through the leaves, flickering, intermittent, arriving and passing without demanding too much. He thought about his classroom. He thought about the end of the school year, the last day, 2 weeks ago. The students leaving with their odd and particular energy, half relieved and half wistful. The seniors especially, who knew they were leaving but could not yet know what they were leaving for. He had taught his final class and stood at the door shaking hands, which he did every year on the last day. And one of the seniors, a girl named Marguerite, quiet and serious, who had written an extraordinary paper on the Reconstruction, had said, "Have a good summer, Mr. Calloway." And he had said, "I'm going hiking with my sons." And she had looked at him with a kind of surprised warmth, as if the information was more personal than she'd expected from a teacher, as if it revealed something. "That's really nice," she had said. He had thought about that on the drive down. That's really nice. It was the kind of thing that sounds simple and is not. The kind of thing that people say when they don't have words for what they actually mean. Which is something like, I can see that this matters to you, and I'm glad for you, and I hope it is what you need it to be." He hoped it would be what he needed it to be. He was not entirely sure what he needed. He knew what he feared, that he had not been present enough, that he had let the ordinary busyness of a life consume too much of the time that should have gone to his sons, that the divorce had created a distance that had never fully closed. He knew what he wanted: 3 weeks in which to be their father without distraction, to walk and talk and be quiet together, and to know, at the end of it, that they had made something, not a product, not an accomplishment, something more like a fact, a thing that had happened and therefore always would have happened, something that would persist in memory, that they could carry forward separately into their separate futures. The trail moved through a gap in the ridge, and for a moment he could see, through the trees, the long valley below, farms and fields, the geometry of human settlement laid against the wild geometry of the mountains, each making sense in its own terms. A red barn, a white house, a road moving between them. He thought about the people in that house, their ordinary afternoon, their not hiking. He thought, "I am here." He thought it again, "I am here." It was not a complicated thought, but it was, he realized, the thought he had been trying to get to all day. Long Branch campsite is a small flat area in the trees above a clear, quick stream, and they arrived in the mid-afternoon as the light was turning the particular amber gold that it becomes in the last few hours before evening. Lower and warmer and more particular. The kind of light that makes everything it touches look significant, chosen. There was one other tent already set up at the far end of the campsite, and as they were choosing their spots, a man emerged from the tent, older, Thomas's age or a little past it, with a gray beard and a navy bandana around his neck and the particular ease of someone who had done this many times. "Good afternoon," the man said. "Afternoon," said Thomas. "Just starting out?" "First day." The man nodded with the respect that experienced hikers extend to beginners, which is not condescension but something more like recognition. He had been where they were. He remembered what it felt like. "Day one's a good one," he said. "Your body doesn't know yet what's coming." "That seems intentional," said Eli. The man smiled. "Absolutely. If your body knew on day one what day 12 felt like, nobody would ever start." He looked at the three of them. "Family? Father and sons," said Thomas. "Wonderful." He said it with a warmth that was completely unironic, in the way of certain older men who have moved past irony and arrived somewhere more direct. "I'm walking to Vermont. Started at Springer 2 weeks ago. Slower going than I planned, on account of a hip that has opinions. Name's Pete. Thomas. This is Owen and Eli." They shook hands in the old-fashioned way, and Pete went back to his tent, and they set up their own camp. Thomas's 2-person tent, he had wanted the extra space, despite Owen's objection that it was extra weight, and Owen and Eli sharing a lightweight 3-season tent that Owen had bought with his stipend money, and that weighed, he had told them proudly, just over 2 pounds. Setting up camp is a ritual, Thomas had learned. You do the same things in the same order: find a level spot, clear the debris, stake the tent, arrange the sleeping pads and bags, hang the food bag, set up the stove. The repetition of it across days becomes a kind of settling, a way of making temporary home. And even on this first night, with no habit yet established, Thomas found something comforting in the process, in having a specific set of tasks, in the doing of them while his sons did theirs nearby, in the quiet competence of 3 people who know what they need to do. He pumped water from the stream, a hand filter, pushing water through a membrane into a clean bottle, watching it come through clear, and brought it back to camp where Owen was heating water for dinner on the small backpacking stove. Dinner was a freeze-dried meal, chicken and rice, and they ate it standing up with long-handled spoons The food reconstituted and hot and good in the way that food is always good when you are hungry and tired in the outdoors, when the calories are what your body needs, and your body knows it. Pete came over and sat with them for a while as the light faded and they drank their after-dinner tea. He was a retired engineer from Ohio, he told them. He had retired 2 years ago, and his wife had encouraged him to do the trail because she could see that he needed something, some large task, and she was wise about what people needed. He had started at Springer 2 weeks prior, and he was going as far as Vermont, maybe Maine, if the hip cooperated. Some days it says yes, some days it says maybe, he said. So far it hasn't said no. That's a good system, Thomas said. It's the only system at my age. Pete looked at the sky through the trees, where the first stars were appearing, faint and tentative, as they always are at the beginning of dark. You boys are lucky, he said to Owen and Eli, and then, looking at Thomas, and you're lucky to be their father. He said it simply, as a fact, without performance. I know, said Thomas. After Pete went back to his tent, the three of them sat in the camp chairs they'd brought, too heavy probably, but Thomas had insisted, and watched the dark arrive the way it arrives in the mountains, not all at once but in stages, the color draining from the west slowly, the trees becoming silhouettes, the shapes of things simplified until what remains is form without detail, tree, ridge, sky. Owen was telling a story. He was telling it to both of them, but looking mostly at Eli, because it was a story from their childhood, a story Eli barely remembered, from when they were 7 and 9, respectively, and they had gone camping with their parents in Shenandoah, and it had rained for 2 days without stopping, and they had spent the entire second day in the tent, playing card games and eating crackers. And Thomas had taught them to play gin rummy, because it was the only card game he knew well, and Owen had won 11 hands in a row, which Thomas disputed. I did not win 11 in a row, Owen said. I won 9, maybe 10. Eli was 8, Thomas said. He didn't fully understand the rules. He understood enough to be devastated when he lost. He was 8. I was devastated, Eli agreed. I remember that part. They laughed, and the laughter went up into the trees and the dark above the trees, and somewhere in the dark, an owl spoke once, and then was quiet. Thomas looked at the sky. The stars were out fully now, not the stars you see from a parking lot or a suburban yard, but real stars, country dark stars, the Milky Way a smear of brightness above them, the sky more star than black when you looked long enough. He had tried to learn the constellations from a book once, when Owen was small, and he had mostly failed, except for Orion, which he had always known, and the Big Dipper, and 1 or 2 others. But he did not need to name them tonight. He just looked at them and felt their unconcern, their profound indifference, which was not cruel, it was just scale, the universe being the size it was, which is a size that makes all human concerns very small, without making them meaningless. The meaninglessness argument had never convinced him. His sons were sitting beside him in the dark on a mountain in Georgia. That was not meaningless. That was, in fact, the opposite of meaningless. That was meaning, present and plain and unambiguous. I'm glad we're here, he said. He said it to the air, to the trees, to no one in particular. Me too, said Eli. Same, said Owen. And then, after a pause, melodic tuatara. What? Said Eli. Nothing. Just, it's a lizard. I was thinking about something I read. He paused. Ignore me. Impossible, Eli said. Thomas smiled in the dark. His sons, his impossible, beloved, soon departing sons. He was here. They were all here. It was the first day. He slept well, despite the ground, despite the new sounds of the forest at night. An animal moving through the underbrush at some point, slow and heavy. Raccoon, Owen whispered from the other tent. Not a bear, raccoon, and the creek below talking to itself, and the wind in the trees, and once, distantly, a great horned owl calling out across the valley in its deep, doubting voice. Who? Who? He lay in his sleeping bag and listened and did not answer, because the owl was not asking him. The owl was asking the night, which knew the answer already. He pressed his face against the real pillow he had brought from home. He slept. The most particles of all time. In the morning, the second morning, the beginning of day 2, he woke before his alarm again and lay in the tent listening, and the birds were there before him, before the light, doing what birds do at the edge of dark, reminding the world that it is about to become morning, which is information the world seems to receive with gratitude every single time. He lay still and listened. North, he thought. We go north. The light came slowly, through the tent wall. Not yet light, but the promise of light, the rumor of it, the way all the best things arrive, not all at once, but in increments, allowing you to prepare, allowing you to be ready. He was ready. End of story 1. The trail continues north. Tomorrow they will descend into the Toccoa River Valley and cross the suspension footbridge over the river, and Owen will tell them more than they wanted to know about suspension bridge engineering. But among these divine projects, the worships and reports projects are made. And Eli will check the weather on his phone and find that rain is coming Thursday. And Thomas will stop at a wide spot in the trail and stand very still for several minutes for no reason he can name. Just standing. Just being in the place where he is. And something will shift in him. Quietly. The way seasons shift. Not in a moment, but over many moments. Accumulated. Until one day you look up, and the world is different. And you realize it has been becoming different for some time. That is the second story. For now, it is enough to have begun. Next in the series, Story 2, the Toccoa River, in which the rain arrives early, the bridge sways in the wind, and Thomas learns something about his younger son that he did not know.